ほら、ルフィ、今一緒に海賊になる仲間を探してるんだ。
Hello guys, welcome to my channel The Wandering Zoro, your go-to destination for anime-related content. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. In today's video, we're going to be diving into part 2 of the series, so be sure to stick around until the end. And let's get started. It wasn't until 5 o'clock that Inko Midoriya returned home. Izuku greeted her with a warm hug. He looked down at his mother but frowned when he noticed the prominent dark bags underneath her eyes. Izuku felt himself wilt upon seeing it, as he believed that her exhaustion was working hard to provide for his useless self. "Mom, you should go to sleep. You look dead on your feet," Izuku commented, smiling down sympathetically at his mom. He hoped she couldn't see the guilt he felt from making her look like this. His mother sighed and nodded her head. She closed her eyes, and Izuku suddenly felt worried that she'd drop as she swayed from left to right. "Yeah, I'm just thankful I've got the next 2 days off," Inko said quietly. "Sorry for coming home late today. There was a villain attack down the main road, so traffic became horrible around the detour," his mother stated, giving her reasoning as to her late arrival. Izuku paled and debated on if he should tell her he was there when it happened. Ultimately, he didn't want to give her a heart attack and kept quiet. "Do you have food you can make yourself for dinner, sweetie?" Inko asked, opening her eyes to look up at her son. Izuku nodded, grabbing his mother's shoulders and started leading her towards her room. "Of course, Mom, you just go to sleep. I can take care of myself," Izuku soothed as he led his mom to her bed. Inko thanked her son before shutting the door, yawning as she did so. Izuku waited until the door was completely shut before running towards the kitchen. Izuku opened the cupboard and snatched an orange box of biscuits before running towards his room. He entered and kicked the door behind him and jumped onto his chair. Izuku typed on his computer and rapidly started typing on his keyboard. He looked up the hero patrol routes in his area, which was a harder task than he initially thought. It was easy to get general schedules of heroes who worked during the day, but it was hard to find anything at night. Izuku hoped it didn't mean that there were hardly any heroes operating after dawn. It would be stupid if that was the case. Majority of crimes happen between 8 p.m. to 6 am. Izuku kept scrolling best he could, but the most he could find was 5 heroes who worked in his district at night. For how large his area was, there didn't seem to nearly be enough heroes working. Why did Izuku suddenly want to know this information? Well, the young teen wanted to experiment what it'd be like being a vigilante. Izuku knows the idea is idiotic. It would be chaotic if Izuku were to try. But Izuku couldn't stop the need he felt to experience the same sensation he had already felt yesterday and again today. He wanted to go out tonight. He wanted to save another person. God, Izuku thought. Was it pathetic he was this desperate to become a hero? What would happen if Izuku liked being a vigilante a bit too much and this whole thing became an every night thing? How likely was that? However, Izuku was a good for nothing. Was it possible for him to do any good? He is just a quirkless Deku with no future. But Izuku has recently discovered he wasn't as helpless as he believed. Izuku grinned at the memory of saving Katsuki and the young girl. He gleamed with delight at the sensation that made his bones jittery and jumpy. But is vigilantism the best way to go around feeling the sensation again? To know what it would be like to be a hero? Izuku tried to think of alternatives, but sighed at the conclusion. He was a Deku, and Dekus could never become heroes. No matter how hard Izuku would try, he always remained as the small, wimpy, pathetic quirkless boy whose number of achievements reflected on the amount of quirks he had. He was useless, or not as much as he previously thought. He definitely was a waste of space in comparison to others such as his classmates, but he does have the potential to do good, even if it is small. So Izuku kept researching. He intended to leave the house at 8 p.m. as that was when crime spiked up. So Izuku would spend the next 2 hours plus devising a plan on how he would go about his time being a vigilante. It wouldn't be as easy for him compared to other vigilantes before. They had a quirk, so he'd need to do something different. Izuku wasn't dumb enough to think he could fight anybody head-on. He was a quirkless weakling and would probably be less than half the size than a lot of the criminals out on the street. So instead of running in like a headless chicken, He'd need to coordinate a plan of attack, and Izuku had an idea. He just hoped this wouldn't badly backfire on him. Dying by the hands of a thug isn't how Izuku wanted to go out. But him dying wouldn't be all that bad. Sure, his mother would be crushed by the news of his death, but it would be a good thing. She'd no longer be burdened by having to financially provide for a quirkless child. Katsuki would also no longer be bothered by Izuku's presence. It would be a win for everyone if he were to die. But he was just too much of a coward to do it himself. Izuku flinched when he heard an alarm. He looked over to his clock phone where he had set his alarm, and it did indeed read 8 p.m. Izuku smiled, although slightly nervous as to what was to come. He shut off his laptop and stood up onto his 2 feet. Izuku crept towards his closet, being careful to not accidentally wake up his mother. He doubts that she'll actually be awoken from Izuku walking around. She was usually a heavy sleeper, but Izuku was in no mood to risk it. Izuku opened his closet door and scanned the dark interior for the clothes he wanted. Izuku reached in and pulled out a dark green jacket. Izuku beamed at the jacket and quickly put it on. Izuku loved this jacket as it gave him a hoodie that he could hide his face in. It also had large pockets inside the jacket, so Izuku could place large items inside. On winter days, he'd walk outside with his analyses book in his pocket, waiting for any kind of hero activity to ask them a question or watch how they fought. However, Izuku has done this less and less as to avoid being seen as a creep. Izuku moved his arms through the sleeves and flicked the hood over his head. Izuku giggled as he pulled the hood down to squash his fluffy hair. He couldn't wear this hoodie most of the year as it was too hot, but now it was close to the end of the year. Winter is coming around and he can wear it more often. Or he could wear it more at night if he continued with his stupid Vigilante charade. Izuku left his black shirt on as it really didn't matter what the shirt he wore was. Now he looked for pants. Izuku first grabbed a pair of dark denim pants but tossed them back in. He couldn't wear shorts either. It was going to be cold at night. So Izuku grabbed the last pair he had, light gray sweatpants. They were a little too long, but they would have to do. He didn't have anything else. Izuku removed the current pair he was wearing and pulled up his new set of pants. Izuku then grabbed his usual red pair of shoes as he didn't exactly have another pair. Now Izuku was dressed, and Izuku gave a stuttering breath as his heart jumped excitedly in his chest to the point it was beginning to hurt the young boy. Izuku was almost ready. He was just missing a few more things. Izuku walked towards his desk and grabbed his new hero analyses book. He was going to give the book a title, but decided against it. If he had another book with a title like that, Katsuki may destroy it again, so Izuku will hope to keep his new book intact. He placed the book into the inside of his jacket, slotting it inside his large jacket pocket. Izuku placed a pen inside as well. He needed it to write. Not much point in having the book if he had nothing to write inside of it. Next, he picked up a blue surgical mask to cover the bottom half of his face. He didn't have a full face mask, so Izuku would have to deal with this. Izuku then grabbed his second item, his phone. His phone was the patrol routes of all the heroes he could find in the area. He'd need to know where they were as Izuku wasn't strong enough to take down villains on his own. He recorded them on a unique document and photo with finger-drawn lines to help indicate Izuku the exact location as well as small notes on the bottom. He did hope that there were more villains out than who he had in his phone. He only had 5 villains recorded that patrolled at night, and he couldn't get the patrol routes of 2 of them. The heroes were Slingshot, Fat Gum, Rock Lock, Beholder, and Kamu Woods. Both Kamu Woods and Beholder were within the top 50 rank heroes, so their patrol routes were kept private, but their districts weren't, which wasn't very useful to Izuku. Unless he knew where they were, he couldn't rely on them to help take down villains. It was good to know that they were around, just not something Izuku should put his faith into if push comes to shove. Izuku opened his phone and looked down at his screen, and his eyes widened upon seeing it. He had wasted 10 minutes. Izuku shoved the phone into the same pocket as his book and jumped towards his door. Slowly he opened the wooden plank and prayed that the creaking noise it made would be minimal. Izuku then crept out from his room and towards the front door. He had to be quiet to ensure he didn't wake up his mother. Slowly he pushed the front door open and wiggled his way out. With one last look into his home, Izuku closed the door. He then turned and ran down the stairs that led to his house. His emotions were a mix of excitement and terror, but Izuku did not question his decision. He had already started this whole idea. He needed to see it through now. To be honest, Izuku was kind of bored. He'd been in a mix of running, jogging, and walking as he looked for any kind of villain activity. Despite his hope of seeing something, it had all turned up blank. Not that Izuku was complaining. Less villain activity is good. It was just, he was hoping to experience the sensation again. So Izuku stopped his hyper-vigilance and began to roam the streets to check out how his neighborhood operated at night. It was bound to be different compared to the day. But just how different? Izuku was about to find out. This would be a good change of pace for the Greenette. He normally was too preoccupied with the variety of quirks he came across that he'd neglect to look at his surroundings. It's how he met the sludge villain that day. There weren't many people currently up and about. The few souls that were around were either homeless or drunkards trying to call a taxi. None of them were causing trouble, so Izuku kept on walking, keeping his down to not attract attention. Izuku did notice the stark contrast of his district's nightlife compared to daytime. It was far too dark than Izuku had ever noticed. Large areas were pitch black, and Izuku counted 3 street lamps missing from their post and another 5 were broken. Why had none of them been fixed? Izuku also made sure to keep an eye out on the particularly dark alleyways but didn't dare go too far down. He wanted to see if anyone was hiding but didn't want to risk moving too far away from the road just in case there was. Izuku continued to walk for another 20 minutes with no sign of crime or danger. Izuku did see someone smoking. Probably weed, but what was he going to do about it? Besides, weed was one of the safer toxins. It wouldn't finish them. Another 10 minutes passed, and Izuku is starting to wonder if he would find any serious crime at all tonight. He'd likely see some if he was traversing across rooftops, but Izuku had no faith in his abilities to not slip and plummet to his death. Drop your wallet unless you want a slit throat. Izuku heard a malicious threat from a male with a deep and raspy voice. Immediately, Izuku became a deer in headlights and snapped his head around in the direction he heard the noise. Wait, please. He then heard a squeak of a plea. Izuku had paused and silently moved closer to the alleyway the voices were coming from. Izuku remained stealthy as he reached the mouth of the alleyway. He poked his head around to look at the attacker and victim and better hear the two converse. It was still dark, so Izuku had trouble seeing. The best form of light he had was from the stars. He could only clearly see one person but not the other. Squinting his eyes, Izuku could make out it was a large man's back, which probably meant the second individual was in front and obscured from Izuku's view. Lower the knife. The second man gasped before grunting as he was bashed against the hard surface. Izuku's eyes widened before he reached up and covered his mouth through his mask to prevent a surprised wheeze. Shut up and do as I say. The man huffed aggressively in a low tone. Izuku gulped at the sight and the man's words. He had never seen a person so openly threatened to kill, only in videos and movies. The impact of those threats meant nothing now when compared to the real situation. There was no way Izuku could engage or even talk to the assailant thanks to his aggression and knife. But Izuku knew a few people around that could. Izuku moved himself from the alleyway and reached into his jacket. He whipped out his phone and compared his current location to the general area where Rock Lock, Fat Gum, or Slingshot would be. Slingshot was the closest in theory, but he also moved the fastest. Not only that the villain had a knife and could cut through the silk created from the insides of his fingers. He knew Slingshot would probably handle it. But the thug's quirk was still in question and Izuku didn't want to risk it. So, he would go with his next best option. Rock Lock, one of the best heroes that fought thugs with weapons who didn't know how to use them. It was quite easy for him thanks to his quirk. He can make objects like the thug's weapon motionless by a simple touch, locking it in the air. He didn't even need to that. Touching their clothes would be enough to suffice. Izuku turned on a dime and ran towards the area Rock Lock was suspected to be at. Thugs usually tried to keep their victims alive as it was easier to track them back to murder than a robbery, so Izuku banked on that fact as he ran away. He didn't stop sprinting and made his way down the large roads until he managed to spot the hero. Rock Lock was currently conversing with a person who he presumes is a fan. He was about to walk up to the hero but froze. What was he going to say to him? Hey, I'm a vigilante. Someone's being rubbed down here. Follow me? Rock Lock would either not believe him and capture him, or yell at him for being annoying and tell him to get lost. Annoying, Izuku thought before an idea popped into his head. Izuku has always been annoying, and his classmates hated him for that fact. So why not use his obnoxious ability for his advantage for once? It shouldn't be too hard to get Rock Lock to chase after him. Rock Lock was a father now, wasn't he? He was always composed and serious, and never a fan of jokesters who tried to make a situation bright and funny when it should never be seen that way. Izuku looked around to see if he could find something that would irk his patience. Izuku's eyes landed on some rocks on the ground and thought that would work. Izuku skipped over and snatched the rocks before looking back over to Rock Lock. He had yet to notice Izuku, busy giving his excited fan an autograph. Rock Lock had his back turned to Izuku, and the fan he is now thanking him profusely and getting ready to leave. Izuku raised his arm up but hesitated. This would probably hurt if he hit him, even it was a small rock, but Izuku did need his attention. Izuku reeled his arm back, then proceeded to lob the small stone towards the back of the hero's head. "Oh you! What the hell?" The man cursed, reaching up and rubbing his head. Izuku winced at it. He wasn't trying to hit the man on the head. It was an accident, but now it would ensure the hero would chase after Izuku, so mission success. Rock Lock looked around for the culprit of the rock throwing. Izuku contemplated before deciding to throw another rock, to further annoy Rock Lock and get the man to come to him fast. There was a current mugging at knife point. As he did, Rock Lock noticed the small, hooded Vigilante gearing up to throw another rock. Izuku pegged the rock at hero as hard as could, but the hero just raised his hand and caught it. He watched the hero growl and intimidatingly narrow his eyes at Izuku. Izuku flinched and tensed at the expression. Rock Lock was still far away from him, but that look alone badly frightened Izuku. Rock Lock dropped the stone and started walking towards Izuku. "All right, kid. You think that's funny?" the hero asked. Izuku took in a big breath, trying to gain courage. He could feel his knees grow weak and feeling wash out from his arm. Doubt clouded his mind, but Izuku forced himself to focus. He could not back out now, not while someone is in danger. Izuku raised his hand above his head and waved at him, before turning around and sprinting away. He heard the hero's footsteps rushing behind Izuku as he sprinted, and now Izuku was in a chase with a hero, and that got his heart pumping. Izuku ran away as Rock Lock chased him, which to Izuku was him leading Rock Lock back to the robbery happening in an alleyway. He heard screams for help by the guy, which made Izuku relieved that they were still there and alive, but felt guilty he took so long. Izuku kept running and he passed the alleyway, but he spun around to move backwards for a bit and looked straight at Rock Lock. He pointed down the alleyway before turning and running away. Rock Lock crossed the alley but stopped when he heard the screaming. He looked into it and saw someone waving a knife threateningly at another. He looked back to the retreating kid and frustratedly muttered under his breath. Rock Lock then ran into the alleyway, leaving Izuku alone. Izuku saw this and paused before jogging his way back towards the scene and peeked his head around the corner, taking his book out of his jacket. Izuku watched as Rock Lock approached the two people, and the large man shouted upon seeing the hero. The thug charged at the hero with a knife clutched close to his body. Rock Lock took a step forward and held his hands out flat in front of him. As soon as the villain got close, he backpedaled and slapped the knife the man held. A soft pink glow shrouded the knife, indicating Rock Lock's quirk was activated on it. The thug swiped the knife at Rock Lock, but missed since his knife pointed to the side. He tried to move the knife, but the direction was locked, and Izuku enthusiastically wrote that down. Izuku guessed that the strength of Rock Lock's quirk was dependent on how many fingers made contact with the inanimate object. Izuku watched as Rock Lock only skimmed the knife, locking the object in a single direction, but it could still be moved around. Izuku wrote down one or two next to it, as he was unsure on if that effect resulted in contact with a single finger or two. Izuku observed the fight. Well, it was more of a beat there. The man couldn't turn the knife, so Rock Lock easily took control with his combat skills. He placed 5 of his fingers on the man's shirt, creating a pink glow. The man was then locked in place from his shirt freezing. The thug growled and began to shake violently as he tried to struggle. But it didn't take long for him to give up after realizing it was futile. Rock Lock then went over to the victim to consolidate him. Izuku was fascinated and began to write about that as well. Watching the interaction between a hero and civilian was quite interesting to Izuku, as he doesn't get to see that often from the videos he watches. This would also be a good thing to know if he decided to continue this vigilante adventure. I should probably get going now. He may come back to get me if he notices that I was here watching, Izuku thought. He got onto his feet and turned around before sprinting away and likely alerting Rocklock. But Izuku was confident he'd get away, and now he was on the search for more people to help. Help! A smile blossomed on Izuku's face, and he pumped his fist in the air. Yet another person he has helped, and the heroic feeling he has been getting filled him once more. Izuku was not done yet, and he dashed around for any more people to assist. Izuku carefully opened the door to his house. He squeezed his head through the door and looked around with panicked eyes. He listened closely, trying to hear if the floor made any loud creaks. He was on the watch for his mother and was on the watch like a dog for intruders. Yet in this situation, he was on the lookout for residents. After not having any indication of his mother being up at this hour, Izuku slipped inside. He hissed and sucked in a breath as he began to tiptoe through his quiet home. Izuku acted as slowly as possible to prevent any noise because with what he was currently wearing, his mother would have questions about where he was late at night. Izuku reached his door and steadily peeled the door towards him. Izuku stepped inside and cautiously shut the door behind him. Izuku let out a deep sigh and began to take off his jacket. He was incredibly relieved at not being caught, as that would be the last thing he wanted. He put his phone, book, and pen on his desk while he chucked his jacket and face mask in his closet. He then hopped into bed and ignored the sweat dripping from his body. He was tired. It was past midnight, and he had spent the last 4 hours running around his block. Izuku let out a light chuckle and remembered all the things that happened tonight. He led Rocklock to a mugging twice, tricked a villain into announcing his presence to Slingshot, and managed to attract Fat Gum to 3 drunk people brawling on the side of the road. He helped people, and Izuku could only describe this feeling as electric. But would this last? Could Izuku realistically go out at night to be some puny vigilante? Would he do more harm than good? Izuku wanted to think about it, but his brain was mush from exhaustion, so he left his squabbling thoughts to future him and got some rest. Izuku groaned and he shuffled underneath his covers. His bones and muscles were aching in pain, which both frustrated and confused Izuku. Yesterday was Saturday, so there was no school for him to get beaten up in. Izuku concentrated on why he was feeling like this, and suddenly yesterday's events flashed in his mind. That woke Izuku up as now his eyes flipped open. He really did it. He went out of the dead of night and acted like a vigilante. Izuku didn't know whether to be happy or disappointed in himself. Izuku, in his desperate endeavor of herodom, has become a villain. Well, vigilante, but it was still against the law. He went out of his own way at the dead of night to look for criminals and have them experience justice. Izuku should be ashamed. But he couldn't help but smile. Izuku draped an arm over his eyes and laughed lowly at himself and the situation. He couldn't control his joy at what he had done. He saved a man from a mugging, stopped a drunken brawl, and was responsible for 2 people going to jail. Izuku felt accomplished in a rush of overwhelming euphoria. He did that. Him, the weak Deku. He felt bad for being a vigilante, but he wasn't technically breaking the law. He didn't assault anyone, and he didn't break into any location to catch the criminals. All he did was lead the thug to a hero or a hero to the thug. He also didn't even have a quirk they could catch him on. For those 4 hours he was out on the street, Izuku has never felt so alive. The adrenaline rush he had when he was running away from Rocklock was nothing short of transcendent. His moments of not feeling so small, a runt compared to everyone around him, is something Izuku had never experienced before. Izuku could pinpoint the exact feeling. It was unknown to him, but he was grateful he had the opportunity to experience it, even if it was only for a short moment. An alarm buzzed, and Izuku turned his head to glare at his phone. He stupidly left it on his desk instead of his bedside table since he was too tired to correct his mistake from last night. The alarm kept ringing, and Izuku groaned. If he wanted to turn it off, he'd have to get up. Izuku forced himself up with a heavy breath, swinging his legs from underneath the covers. His bones really did feel stiff and weightier than normal. But that is something he'll have to improve. Izuku got himself out of bed, using his determination to get him moving. Izuku grabbed his phone and turned it on to look at the time. His eyes widened when he saw it was nearly 10 o'clock. I hadn't meant to sleep in. I almost miss Mom leaving for work. Although I was up at until 12 last night, so it isn't really that surprising, Izuku muttered to himself. Izuku opened his door and looked towards the lounge room and saw his mother watching television. She turned at the sound of Izuku opening his door and smiled upon seeing him. "Morning, honey. I tried waking you up earlier, but you wouldn't budge. What time did you go to bed?" Inko questioned, looking over to her son. Izuku laughed sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. He needed to come up with a suitable lie to satisfy his mother. "Sorry, I lost track of time watching videos last night. I hope I didn't disturb you," Izuku answered nervously. He couldn't tell her that he went out being a vigilante last night. She'd lose her head. His mother seemed to buy his lie and gave a hearty chuckle at her son. "Oh, Izuku, please don't do that tonight. You have school tomorrow," Inko laughed. Izuku smiled nervously, thanking the heavens that she'd bought his lie. He didn't want to think about what would happen if his mother knew of his escapade. "I wish we could talk more, Izuku, but I need to go to work now," Inko told as she stood up. Izuku straightened before bouncing towards his mother. He wrapped her in a tight hug, which she happily returned. She then walked towards the door and grabbed a small plastic bag. Inside the bag was her uniform that she would wear at the retirement home she worked at. It wasn't acceptable clothes to wear outside, so she would change at her workplace. "Bye, Mom. Have a good day," Izuku waved. His mother returned with her own hyper hand wave. Izuku closed the door as his mom entered her car. He walked back inside and moved towards the kitchen to grab himself some breakfast. He was alone once again, and now he was stuck to deal with his own thoughts. He had an entire day now to think on a question he was too tired to think of yesterday. Was he going to run out to the street again tonight? Izuku and his mother was eating dinner. He hadn't told her about his plan to try out some vigilantism that night, and was planning never to. He knows that she would never allow him to do this under any circumstances any good mother should. But it still pains him to know that he is lying to her. But it wouldn't be the first time. He's had to lie to her a lot to keep Kitsuki safe and not worry her from his injuries. So technically, this wasn't anything new. "So, honey, are you still interested in going to UA?" his mother asked. Izuku lowered his head and tried thinking. Was there a point to try for UA? He wouldn't make it in anyway, and with his newfound drive for vigilantism, that's a whole can of beans he doesn't want to open. So Izuku shook his head. "I don't know. I've kind of lost my love for heroes a bit. I mean, general studies is still an option, but I've got to think on it," Izuku answered. He saw his mum brighten when he didn't say yes or of course, which did hurt Izuku. But he knows it is just his mum's worry over him. She reached towards him from the table and put her hands over his, looking him in the eyes. "Just know that whatever you choose, I will support you." "Okay," she said. Izuku smiled and nodded. Would she be supportive of his want to be a vigilante? Because Izuku had made his thought about what he was going to do. He couldn't stop his need to feel what it was like to be a hero, and he would be out tonight as a vigilante once again. Obviously with a few improvements. Izuku noticed a few things on his last trip out that he wanted fleshed out. Izuku went out of the house for some quick shopping using his own pocket money. He grabbed shiny green goggles that will help conceal his eyes to make it harder to tell who he was. Izuku also got a different face mask so he could breathe easier, as it became quite restricting when he was panting his lungs out. Izuku also bought a slingshot, as it would be easier to launch rocks at heroes to gain their attention. He was also got some marbles as well to fire with them. However, when Izuku set up a pillow to fire the marbles in his room, he quickly discovered it was a lot harder to aim with a slingshot than he originally believed. So, he is deciding not to bring them when he goes out tonight. "Have you done your homework, honey?" Inko asked Izuku as he took their empty bowls to the kitchen sink and started washing them. Izuku turned his head to look at his mother and noticed she was beginning to yawn. "Yes, Mom. I did it ages ago," Izuku answered. He had already finished the homework. He did it during class, but he has spent a while looking over to make sure it was correct. But no matter how long he took, Izuku would always get half of it wrong, so he has given up on putting too much effort into it. Izuku was just stupid, and he felt so far behind the rest of his classmates. "Do you want to watch a movie, Izuku? I renewed our streaming subscription," Inko asked, looking over to Izuku with her large green eyes. Izuku piped up and jumped from his spot, almost dropping the fork he was washing. "Yes, please." Izuku asked excitedly. It wasn't often he got to spend quality time with his mother. Their schedules clashed between school and her work. She worked night 3 times a week and during the day 3 times, so either she wasn't home while Izuku was or she laid asleep in bed, exhausted from work. Izuku felt guilty for being this selfish and needy for wanting his mom's attention while she was overworking herself to provide financially. But this was the only times he felt loved and safe, and that was a feeling he could not replace. Well, I'm off to bed, honey. You should go too. School is tomorrow, Inko said, her eyes dropping from her tiredness. She stretched and let out a yawn before pushing herself up from the couch. Izuku nodded his head at his mother's words and stood up after her, now awkwardly waiting for her to move. Good night, Izuku. Get some sleep tonight, Inko said, turning around and embracing Izuku in a bone-crushing squeeze. Izuku laughed and hugged his mother back, appreciating the warmth that this simple gesture of affection was giving him. I will, Mum, Izuku responded. They remained locked together for a few seconds before they backed away. Inko walked towards her room and closed the door behind her. Izuku copied the action except going to his room instead. He twisted the knob and pushed his door open, revealing his hero-encrusted room. Izuku ignored the vacant stays of his posters and shut the door behind him. It was 9:30 and Izuku knew his mom would getting some sleep for a stressful day tomorrow. Izuku had school tomorrow as well, so it would be wise for him to get some rest as well. But he couldn't. Izuku was not tired. In fact, he was restless. His one-time vigilante run wasn't nearly enough to suppress his hunger. He needed more. So Izuku started getting ready for his second night out. He grabbed his jacket and laid it down on the bed as well as a black t-shirt and the same long gray sweatpants as yesterday. He chucked his analyses book on top of his jacket with a pen before moving away to find more items. Izuku began to search the contents of his drawers. The first was small padded gloved Izuku knew he had. He had forgotten why he had them or when he had received them. He just knew he had them. Izuku slid them on but found his hands were too big to wrap the Velcro at the end of his gloves. So Izuku grabbed some scissors he kept on his desk and cut the useless Velcro strap off. The gloves were tight, but they fit, and Izuku was confident that they wouldn't cut off his blood circulation. Izuku found his new black face mask before throwing it over his head for it to land on his bed. Not far from his mask was his goggles, but Izuku decided to leave them alone for now. He kept searching his drawers until he managed to locate all of his things. Izuku reached into the bottom drawer of his cabinet underneath his desk and pulled out his medical supply box. Izuku left it alone before moving towards his closet. Inside, he grabbed a belt that he never wore simply because he never needed it and tiny bags. The tiny bags Izuku looked like small backpacks with a small flap that closed with the use of magnets. Him and his mother had made these when Izuku was a lot younger. Izuku actually had small items him and his mother made together as arts and crafts, as it was their way of spending time together. Honestly, Izuku misses those times. Izuku grabbed a box in his closet, and it was filled with a lot of random junk that him and his mom would use to craft small trinkets. One of those things they would use was sharp hooks, and that was exactly what Izuku needed. Izuku snatched the hooks and poked them through the bag. Izuku then stabbed them into his belt and looped the hooks so he wouldn't stab himself with the hooks. Izuku had 7 tiny bags but was only able to hook 5 of them onto his belt thanks to his lack of hooks. Well, at least he had most of them on. Now that Izuku had his belt, he put on his sweatpants, black t-shirt, and dark green jacket. Izuku then wrapped the belt around his waist but started to struggle in actually tightening the damn thing. He had never put on a belt before and found the process of looping the narrow end of leather through the metal loop to be quite difficult. Once Izuku had it on, though, he grabbed his face mask and put it on. Izuku then reached over to his desk to grab his goggles. The young teen managed to wiggle them on his head and blinked once he had them on. His vision darkened a little, but it was hardly impactful, but perhaps it may hurt his vision since it was already dark. Izuku could always discard the goggles if he found that to be the case. Now Izuku was decked out in his full vigilante clothing, but he was still missing a few of his materials. Izuku grabbed his book and put it inside of his large jacket pocket along with a pen and his phone. But there was a few more things Izuku wanted to grab. He had a slingshot and marbles but left it in his cabinet drawer. He wasn't good at using the slingshot yet, so he wanted to wait and get better before using them. Izuku walked forward and bent down to the large white box he pulled out earlier. He opened it and revealed the small number of medical supplies he had stashed and hid from his mother. When out being a vigilante, Izuku had seen a lot of injured people who lived on the street, and Izuku wanted to try and help them. He also would need to tend to victims' wounds when they got hurt, so Izuku thought it to be a good idea to have these things on him. He may not have had a lot of supplies, but it was too much for his tiny satchels he had on his belt to carry. So Izuku just grabbed the essentials: bandage wraps, disinfectant, wipes, and tweezers. By cramming those items into 4 of his satchel bags, he had 1 bag left. Izuku looked down at the assortment of random things he had hoarded into his large white box. He didn't know what else he could put in, but knew he needed at least something. May as well be prepared, just in case. Izuku found his eyes naturally gravitating towards the petroleum jelly, what he used to help his burn wounds. Izuku tried to ignore it, as he believed it was him naturally being drawn to it since he used it so often, but caved into his desires. People getting burned wasn't that rare, and fire quirks are the most common elemental quirk, so Izuku didn't think it would be a bad idea to grab it. Izuku pocketed the jelly and stood up straight. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. It was almost 10 o'clock at night, but Izuku couldn't leave earlier. His mom had only just gone to sleep. Izuku now had to figure out a way on how he was going to get out of his home. Izuku didn't feel confident enough to leave through the front door. If for whatever reason his mom was awake or was awoken by his activity, he'd be screwed. Immediately, that cut his options down to a single solution: his bedroom window. Izuku walked over to and pushed the glass screen upwards. He moved his head out of the window and looked down and cringed. He lived in a small apartment with his mother. The apartment they lived in was 2 stories and had 6 total housing spaces, 3 on each floor. Izuku lived on the 2nd floor and was on the left side, so he did have immediate access onto the street, but he'd have to jump down to get there. Izuku felt his legs shake at the thought of breaking them at the fall. Izuku looked about inside and tried to come up with another solution. He probably could just walk out through the front door. But what if he was wrong? How would he explain his get-up to his mother or tell how why he was leaving the house late at night? This was his only option. Izuku sighed nervously and put his head back outside the window and looked around to see if he could find anything to help his descent. Looking to his right, Izuku spotted a drain pipe that extended down to the ground. It was far, so Izuku would have to jump to reach it, but it seemed possible. Izuku shuddered nervously as his legs didn't want to act. Jumping out of his window was not very enticing to the young Izuku. Izuku then shook his head and slapped his cheeks. What is wrong with me? I ran around as a vigilante, for goodness sake. I can perform a simple jump. Izuku yelled to himself internally. Izuku steeled himself and hopped onto his window, crouching like a gremlin as he leaned out of his room. Izuku breathed rapidly but forced himself to keep his eyes on the drainpipe. Izuku shook nervously but willed himself to not chicken out. The boy started to count down in his head. 3. Izuku started, bouncing up and down slightly as his legs refused to stay still. 2. Izuku cracked his neck by rolling it around. He now glared at the pipe and to convince himself to jump. 1. Izuku mentally told, and despite his nerves and shaky form, Izuku forced his legs to push up. Izuku leapt forward, his upper body extending out like a cat, leaving his feet behind in the wind. Izuku squealed as he slammed on the drainpipe and gripped tightly on the pipe as he felt the shifting metal. Izuku grunted as he smashed his knees against the hard wall as he whipped around in the air. Izuku then pulled himself close to the drainpipe and clutched his entire body against it. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut and breathed heavily. A few moments passed before Izuku cracked an eye open. He looked around and saw that he was not dead or falling. Izuku bent his head away and looked around. He was indeed on the pipe and successfully jumped to safety. Izuku smiled and laughed at his own triumph. He couldn't believe he had actually done it. It was actually exciting. Izuku now started slowly clambering down the drainpipe with a surprising feeling of elation he had. Jumping to the drainpipe as another adrenaline rushed to Izuku, and he enjoyed that feeling. Was he an adrenaline junkie? Izuku shrugged and stopped worrying about. He landed on the ground with a satisfying thud. Izuku grinned madly before racing out into the night. He was going to try and save more people, and Izuku couldn't hold off any longer. Izuku was running around, not looking for crime off the bat. He had only just left his house, and the previous night took him over half an hour to find any villain activity. So Izuku was quite surprised to see a hooded man running down the street. He raced towards a woman, making her scream at his aggressive approach. The thug grabbed the woman's handbag, but she put up a fight. He kept trying to snatch it away, but the woman leaned back and pulled on the straps of her handbag with all of her might. But it didn't last much longer when the man pushed his foot against the woman's stomach and kicked her to the ground. Izuku was too shocked at the sudden appearance of thievery. He hadn't acted. It wasn't until the man started running and ran towards Izuku is when his brain started working again. Izuku ducked into an alleyway, the thief not noticing from him shouting at the screaming woman. Izuku racked his head around what he could do, and he looked around. Izuku frowned when he saw that there was sticky silk in the alleyway he stood, meaning that Slingshot had already been here and now left. Knowing his speed, Izuku wouldn't be able to catch up to the hero. Not that Izuku was going to try. Slingshot swung around on light posts and walls with his sticky web to maneuver around Musafatsu. Izuku's face blew up as an idea surged into his brain. Izuku then poked his head back around to spot the thief running in his direction. Izuku readied himself and had his hand open, ready to steal the bag back from the thug. As the thug ran, he was unaware to the vigilante lurking in the alleyway. Izuku burst forward fast, pushing his body onto the villain and grabbing the bag. Izuku then reeled himself back, taking the handbag out of the villain's hands. The villain stumbled, tumbling away as he tried to keep balance, obviously not expecting the attack. He turned his head with fear only to see a short boy with a green hoodie holding his handbag instead. The villain was obviously expecting an intimidating hero to be staring him down, so he was pleasantly surprised to see a young kid instead. The man grunted in annoyance and glared at Izuku but smirked cockily as he stepped towards Izuku. "Stupid brat. Unless you want to get hurt, hand over the bag." The thug yelled, charging forward at Izuku. Izuku tensed at the action. An image of Kitsuki circulated in his mind. But as quick as Izuku blinked, the image of the man running at him re-emerged. Izuku dodged the punch the villain sent his way, moving to the side and running past him. Izuku then kicked him in the leg. The knee was jutted forward and it made the villain trip, and he fell right into a glob of sticky silk from Slingshot. "Huh, wait, what the hell? You brat, I'll get you!" The thug shouted. He tried to crane his neck to glare at Izuku, but with the web stuck to his body, he could hardly move. He attempted to pry himself off of the ground, but the web essentially made him glued to the hard floor. Izuku laughed quietly to himself as he backed out of the alleyway with the handbag tightly gripped in his fingers. He felt bad that the villain was in a compromising position, but couldn't help but feel happy that the help get the villain subdued, and now they were angry at him. Technically, it was Slingshot. Izuku would have had no way to stop the villain without the left-behind silk from the hero. But Izuku certainly assisted in restraining the villain, and Izuku felt accomplished and proud. "Hey!" Izuku heard another voice yell. His neck snapped in the direction of the voice, and saw the woman who the handbag belongs to run towards him. Izuku panicked slightly. He didn't technically do anything illegal, but he'd rather not have to answer questions or get reprimanded by other people or even heroes. Izuku dropped the bag, the body smooshing down on the pathed floor below him, only staying up from the items inside. Izuku turned away from the woman and started running away from her. The night was still fresh, and he'd already helped someone. Wait, would this technically be slower since he was out past 10 instead of 8 like yesterday? Would he stay out longer to compensate? "Thank you," Izuku heard the woman shout. Izuku turned his head back around to see the woman waving at him and held a phone in her other hand, presumably calling the police. Izuku smiled and turned his head back around. He helped another person, and Izuku loved to feel the warm feeling in his chest when he did that. Izuku wanted to feel it more. The night was still young as Izuku briskly jogged around his neighborhood. He was venturing out much further out than he had yesterday, so he'd have to go farther back home when he was too tired to continue. Izuku wasn't sure why he was doing this. He was still new to the whole Vigilante fiasco, so making things harder on himself isn't a good idea. But he felt like he could help more in a more crime-populated area, because less residential buildings situated the few around to be easier targets to home invasions. Not only that, robbers were more likely to target closed stores or service stations as it was quicker to grab the money, therefore safer. So Izuku felt like he could assist the heroes in finding villains performing these crimes, as villains wouldn't try to do these kinds of things with the knowledge of a licensed individual around. So an extra pair of eyes wouldn't hurt. Of course, Izuku realized that this was far more dangerous. He was at least smart enough to understand this. He also was untrained in actual combat, so he'd be as good as dead if any villains managed to get their grimy hands on him. Heroes went into dangerous situations all of the time to rescue civilians. So Izuku needed to be brave and follow their footsteps if he wants to help people as well. It would also be counterintuitive to not try and help people in the area where crime is more likely to occur. He was trying to be a vigilante to help people when they are in danger. Turning a blind eye to those people would make Izuku feel like he was doing this for attention, and Izuku didn't want to have any more people belittle him about being the quirkless freak asking for sympathy. He still had heroes to run to get help. Rocklock worked in this area late on weekends and continues until the early morning. Izuku also knew Beholder would also be patrolling the area on Sunday. He just didn't know exactly where. She was a strong hero. Rank 15, a lot of her information is kept secret. Izuku greatly admired Beholder. She used quirkless combat to fight, and her skills combined with her third eye quirk allowed her to be ranked 4th in her prime years. Izuku is surprised she hasn't retired yet. Her age is unknown, but she has been operating for more than 30 years. She has to be close to 60 by now. She mostly works at night now, rarely being spotted by reporters or citizens in the day. Izuku thought that was smart, as if Izuku was going to be a villain, he'd exclusive work at night. It was just too dangerous during the day. A single hero could be on his tail at any time with backup no more than a minute away. Compare that to after dusk and the crime rate skyrockets. Although less civilians are in danger from an attack due to them being in their homes, it also means fewer prying eyes on their illegal activity. It confused as to why so few heroes patrolled at night. Most villains are strictly nocturnal. They'd have no reason to be up during the day. It also helped explain underground heroes were so successful. Hardly any person ever witnessed the off-the-clock villain takedowns, allowing them to stay anonymous. It explains why there are only 5 televised vigilante captures, as most people who become vigilantes act at night. Say the few rebellious teenagers. Izuku wondered if they were paid as much as daytime heroes. Izuku sighed. Hopefully Rocklock wouldn't be too upset if he had to use him again. He really was the only hero he had reliable access to. Maybe it would be something Izuku could actually handle on his own. But he doubts that would be likely. He was useless and accident-prone. He was bound to get injured. Maybe he could train? Would he be able to get good enough to take on adults or others with powerful quirks? Izuku didn't know, but improbable for a Deku like him to do so. Maybe if it would be easier for him to just disappear and take Kitsuki's advice. But he wanted to save people. Izuku knew he could contribute something to others before he died. Even if just stopped a simple mugging, it was enough for him to feel at peace. Izuku had reached a large and relatively empty double 2-lane road with a few cars driving down. On the corner was a service station that Izuku was walking by. He noticed something in the window of the store. It was a 24/7 store, and the lights inside were brightly illuminating the inside of the building, so that wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the orange flash near the counter in the store. Izuku looked closer, noticing the bright-colored flash, and saw a man with spiky blonde hair pointing one hand at the clock with spitting fire leaking down his hand. Both of the clock's hands were raised high in the air as he looked ahead at the man threatening his life. Izuku registered the situation and knew he had to get help. Quickly, Izuku turned and sprinted away from the scene. Robberies like that can take a turn for the worse very fast. He needed to find Rocklock as soon as possible. Izuku reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone and pulled up the image for Rocklock's patrol route on Sunday. He hoped Rocklock will be willing to chase him again. So, Rocklock, you've recently become a dad and now are getting married. Congrats. Beholder commended the man next to her. The male hero smiled and turned to the veteran hero next to him. Her hair was slowly graying from age, making her originally blonde hair look platinum blonde, and was well built. Far taller and larger than the younger hero she was talking with, showing how muscular she is despite her old age. The two are bundles of joy. I must admit, I'm very lucky. Rocklock laughs. Beholder shakes her head, but the elderly woman smiles amusedly at Rocklock. Her quirk is called Third Eye. She has a large eye on her forehead that remains closed majority of the time. But if Beholder is at risk of being hurt, it will open and allows her to see what will harm her before she gets injured. An additional power her quirk has is being able to fire a strong blue beam of prismatic light, and after use, it disables her quirk for over 24 hours. Not even quirk scientists understand how her quirk can do that. Mum, but you do have a part to play in it. You've always been a Romeo Coop. Beholder starts but stops. Rocklock looks at her confused, wondering why she suddenly stopped talking until he notices her third eye open. He grabs a staff that he always holds and gets ready to fight. The woman then scoffs, her eye closing. She turns her head to look at a street corner hidden by a building. Don't worry, it's just some hooligan who's going to throw a rock at me, Beholder says with displeasure. Rocklock eyes widen for a moment and moves in that direction, turning to face the veteran hero. Wait, is it a kid wearing a green hoodie, around 5 feet? Rocklock asks. Beholder raises an eyebrow. Yeah, he a regular with you? She asks. Rocklock shakes his head. He did the same to me yesterday, but both times ended up leading me to muggings. If he throws a rock at you, he wants you to chase him, Rocklock answers. Beholder looks at him skeptically before shrugging. Well, if you're sure, she responded casually, needing a distraction to make up for the quiet night. Rocklock spins back around but rushes towards the building corner. He watched the young Vigilante duck around and throw the rock at him. Rocklock dodges and pursues the young teen, chasing the boy down who had just thrown the rock at him just like the day before. Beholder followed after her more youthful hero, curious to see if this really was a lead to a potential villain. Izuku was glad that Beholder was there along with Rocklock, especially pleased that they both decided to follow him. The villain he was taking them to is dangerous with his fire quirk, so more effort to subdue them is better. Izuku additionally made a mental note to himself that those two could be friends and might be close to each other when they are both out patrolling in the same area. Izuku quickly made it back to the street where he saw the robbery. He was hyperventilating a tiny bit. What if he was too slow to gain the hero's attention and the cashier got hurt? Or worse, dead? What if the robber already got away because Izuku wasn't quick enough? Thankfully, Izuku watched the offender rush out of the store with a large bag in his hands. Izuku practically sighed in relief as he witnessed that. But his relief faded as he watched the villain run to a car parked underneath the... Izuku may still not have been quick enough, just too late. He needed a way to at least buy the heroes an ounce of time. So Izuku whirled his head around to try and see something. On the ground, laying in the tiny bits of grass on the side of the road, was a closed and dented metal tin. With little thought, Izuku reached down and grabbed the tin without stopping and proceeded to lob it at the villain. Hey, you forgot something, Izuku shouted. The man got to his car with his keys in his hands but looked over to Izuku when he shouted. He was confused before crying out in pain as the metal tin Izuku threw landed a direct hit on his face. The man yelled out and the surprise attack made him fall down on his back. He then growled angrily and aggressively pushed himself back onto his feet, leaving the bag of money he took from the store and keys he had on the ground. Fire swirled around his hands as he seemed to charge up. Izuku froze like a deer in headlights. The man's quirk looked strong. The villain then launched a sporadic stream of fire towards Izuku. Izuku looked ahead with fear and instinctively moved out of the way by jumping to the side and rolling. The man looked towards Izuku and was preparing another attack before noticing the heroes running towards him. The man then swore loudly before grabbing his keys and bag of money and tried to get back into his car. Rocklock launched his staff at the villain like a javelin and it smashed into his hand. The villain yelled out and pulled his hand away from the car. Izuku watched a small black ring drop between the villain's feet with a broken bit of metal sticking out. He broke the key to his car, Izuku thought as he looked at the villain. He watched him back up as the villains ran towards him and yelling at him to surrender. Instead, he chose to emit more fire from his palms and let them sizzle in his hands. Izuku analyzed his quirk and quickly came up with the conclusion that he had to power up his fire before he could send it out away from him like a flamethrower. Also, judging by his previous attack against him, Izuku believed that he had little control of his fire the further they got away from him. but it was likely from lack of experience with the quirk. Izuku got up from the ground and brushed himself off and looked over to the heroes running past him to handle the dangerous villain. Izuku was excited to watch another hero fight and pulled out his book to start writing things down, but felt something off about the situation. He could see Beholder expertly navigated herself around the flames thanks to her quirk predicting the attack, and start attacking him with brute force. Rocklock also advanced towards a villain with the aim to touch his shirt by using a metal plate that extends itself when a button is pressed to close the distance he had with the villain. He had a minor part of his quirk activated on the makeshift shield to prevent it from being damaged, locking its current state in place. Izuku could see all of these things, yet he wasn't focused on any of it. He was far too preoccupied by trying to figure out what was missing in this situation. Izuku looked inside the store through the windows and was glad to see there wasn't any fire or obvious scorch marks. Izuku hoped that extended to the cashier that was working behind the counter. The cashier, Izuku realized with a jolt and immediately zoomed inside, having to wait a split second as the automatic door opened for him. He looked towards the counter and saw that he wasn't where Izuku has last seen him. Is he behind the counter? Izuku questioned in his head, before running towards the counter to check if the person was all right. Izuku jumped onto the counter and leaned his body to see the ground on the other side. Lo and behold, the cashier laid on his back with a cloth jammed in his mouth and a large burn on his left shoulder. Izuku hopped down next to him and looked over the man with worry. "Asa, are you okay?" Izuku asked, slightly panicked. The man looked up at Izuku, shocked to see the boy there, especially in his attire. He shakily nodded his head. "Did you call the cops?" Izuku then asked. Again, the man nodded. Izuku looked at the cloth in his mouth. He wanted to take it out, but stopped when it didn't actually seem to be jammed in his mouth, most likely there by choice. Izuku looked over to the cashier's burn, which looked bad, but judging by the power the villain's quirk had, Izuku was grateful it wasn't far worse. "Do you want me to try and help your burn? I am experienced with treating this injury," Izuku asked, but all he got was a muffled voice. "Could you tell me where the first aid kit is?" Izuku asked right after, taking the man's noise as a yes. The man shakily raised his finger from his good arm, his cell phone gripped in his hand he used to point. Izuku followed the man's finger to see the medical kit on the wall. Izuku didn't waste time and made haste, moving over to the kit and ripped it off the wall. Izuku then raced behind the counter to start treating the clerk's burn. The man was shocked at how well Izuku was going about it as he looked quite young. Izuku thanked Kitsuki in the back of his mind as he indirectly gave him the knowledge of treating severe burn wounds and was glad he took his petroleum jelly with him. Sign from the universe Izuku took. "Ice?" the man asked with a shaky breath, the cloth spitting onto his neck. Izuku looked down to his eyes and shook his head. "Putting ice there will make you go into shock and can cause permanent damage to your nerves. Don't worry. If you call the police, an ambulance will be on the way with better stuff. This is just to help for the time being," Izuku responded, speaking as kindly and softly to the man as possible to make him feel safe. That was something heroes did. As soon as Izuku finished applying the supplies to the man, he heard sirens. Now Izuku wasn't technically a vigilante and hadn't done anything that would warrant a vigilantism charge. Yet, Izuku knows it would not be of best interest to stick around for much longer. So Izuku got up on his 2 feet, turning on his heels and running towards the door. Izuku gave a glance to the fight in front of the service station and was glad to see Rocklock had frozen the man's clothes in place. He had his arms in the air so he couldn't attack them with his fire, and it seemed like Beholder was threatening him if he even tried. Izuku smiled, proud of what he helped achieve before running off. 3 hours later, Izuku crawled through his bedroom window, jumping towards the ledge of his open window from the drainpipe. He heaved himself through the small opening and barely managed to catch himself before he crashed onto his bedroom floor. He did not need to wake up his mother. Crawling with his hands, Izuku managed to pull the rest of his body inside like a worm. He croaked out from exhaustion as he laid flat on the floor, resting his aching muscles momentarily from the tough feat he forced them to pull off. However, Izuku needed to actually get onto his bed. So, with a tired body and heavy mind, Izuku pulled himself onto his feet and started to undress himself from his vigilante clothing. Tonight, had been far more stressful than the previous nights, as there were double criminal sightings Izuku had seen and helped resolve by directing heroes to them or distracting a criminal long enough for a hero to arrive. Izuku felt so elated every time his plan of action became a success. It was a satisfying longing that he had been dying to experience that he managed to achieve in just 2 days. Izuku took off his belt and placed it carefully into his closet to not create any noise. It was 2 and he doubted his mother would appreciate being woken up at this hour. Izuku debated on what pajamas he would wear but decided to screw and go to bed for the second time that week in nothing but his underwear. Izuku groaned in frustration as his phone alarm buzzed from his desk. He left his phone on his desk again, which meant Izuku had to get up and turn it off. Izuku rolled and seized in pain. Izuku's eyes shut open, and his legs launched down to his thigh and grabbed it. Izuku clenched his teeth together to suppress his howl as he shook his body from the cramp he was having. Izuku groveled in his bed and slowly stretched out his leg to remove the muscle-tearing pain he suddenly felt. Once that was done, Izuku laid on his bed, except now he was on his stomach. His mind was still processing if he was still in pain or not. He had momentarily forgotten about his alarm, but he could only ignore the blaring sound for so long. Slowly Izuku sat up, getting on his knees. He judged if his thigh would cramp up again if he moved. After not feeling any more pain, he tested the stability of his legs and got off of his bed. Still not experiencing any more pain, Izuku took the rest of his steps towards his phone. Izuku picked it up and swiped off his alarm. He was welcomed to a beautiful view of his home screen. It was a picture of him and his mother hugging each other while giving great wide smiles at the camera. Yet despite the wholesome picture, he couldn't help but frown disappointedly at the rest of the contents. It was 6:03 and the date was December 10th on a Monday, which meant school was back on today. Izuku grumbled and dropped his arm with his phone down to his side. The weekend had gone by much faster than what Izuku would have liked. Everyone felt dismay whenever school came back on, but unlike Izuku, none of them felt like a clown in a circus or a cat in a dog cage. But Izuku was willing to, but none of them were out until 2 at night, running around city to try and lead heroes to crime. Smart of them as well, since Izuku had done that and now he was paying the price. Izuku's limbs felt sluggish, and every fiber of his muscles ached in pain. Izuku also sniffled. One of his nostrils is blocked. He knew he was coming down with something. It was probably his vigilante shenanigans to blame. Anxiety consumed Izuku, and he numbly rubbed his elbow. Thoughts of what could happen today flooded his mind, and they were much worse than usual. The last time he saw Kitsuki, he was furious. Izuku would really like to avoid him today at all costs because he likely had something to say about the stunt Izuku pulled with the sludge villain. But Izuku knew he wouldn't be able to escape Kitsuki. So reluctantly Izuku got ready for school. It was only now did he realize that he forgot to sew new fabric over the hole in his school uniform. Luckily, he had a second shirt, but it was far more weathered and torn compared to his other one. But Izuku sucked it up and threw the uniform on. He gave his mum goodbye and made his way to school. Today was her one day off, and Izuku was happy to know she was taking the time to relax. She was usually too busy to do that even when not at work. He had been getting better at cleaning and cooking in order to lessen the burden he creates while living in the same house as her. He gave her a hug and wished her day to be relaxing before heading to school. It wasn't that far of a walk, around 15 minutes, and Izuku made an effort to always be punctual as the teachers were quite strict with his attendance, behavior, and work ethic. So Izuku always went to school with a 15-minute leeway, so if anything unplanned happened, he would still have more than enough time to not be late. Izuku rounded a corner but slowed to a stop when he picked up something. He smelled something odd in the air. He sniffed it again before horror settled in. Izuku had just gotten a whiff of caramel, on a street with not a single piece of food on it. That smell is something Izuku has become accustomed to smelling. Not because he liked caramel. Actually, his constant exposure to the smell has given him an irrational fear towards anything caramel-related, even the word. Why the smell of caramel was prominent in Izuku's daily life was from a guy who sweat nitroglycerin. Deku! An angry, gritty voice shouted, and Izuku immediately flinched and shrunk in his place. Izuku looked ahead from where the voice came and saw Kitsuki stomping his way towards him. Izuku again felt him to be so stupid to not notice the very teen he was just quivering about was probably standing in front of him the entire time. Izuku watched with absolute terror as Kitsuki menacingly came closer to him. He wanted to run. Izuku wanted to flee and hide underneath his blankets but found his feet glued to the ground. "Keikachi-chan," Izuku croaked in fear, stumbling over a single word as he watched his tormentor and ex-best friend glare at him with immense hatred. Izuku wondered what he did to deserve that look from Kitsuki. Izuku squeaked when Kitsuki roughly grabbed the front of his shirt. Izuku proceeded to be slammed against all from the taller boy, banging his head against the cool hard surface. Izuku jerked his head away as a loud sound of an explosion sounded from next to his ear. But his movements seemed to anger Kitsuki more. Shakily, Izuku steadily found the courage to look up at Kitsuki. Kitsuki stayed down at his wimpy figure with a sneer. He was growling and shaking with rage. Once their eyes met, he became even angrier and pops from his quirk shot out again, making Izuku shrink further. A tactic that he developed to try and reduce the amount of harm that he received from each day of the school week. He looked at Izuku with a look that only could convey rage and hatred, leaving Izuku with one question. Why did he hate me so much? Deku. He spat Izuku's insult of a nickname like it personally offended him, and for some reason it might have. Whatever stunt you pulled yesterday, don't expect me to repay you for it. I didn't need your help, he said, trying to keep his anger as controlled as possible. But Kitsuki always had been miserable at accomplishing that feat. But for some reason, he looked off. Was it desperate? Izuku wasn't sure. It was being overwhelmed by Kitsuki's anger. His hand next to Izuku's head was shaking slightly. Something else was on the ash blonde's mind. Izuku was concerned for his childhood friend, but he wouldn't dare ask what he was upset about. He knew better than to get into Kitsuki's business, as last time he tried, Izuku was out on the floor. Izuku quivered as his soft hands delicately came up in front of him as a surrender action. I don't want to be repaid, Bakugo. Izuku replies with enough nerves to cause an earthquake. Izuku did speak that sentence oddly slow, but it was not to receive any unnecessary harm from Kitsuki, as Izuku knows he despises his stuttering. I just was attacked by that villain a few minutes before. I was the reason it got away, so I felt like I had to do something as none of the heroes were. I answer. Izuku shook and shut his eyes like iron doors in fear when he saw the fierce movement of Kitsuki taking his arm away from Izuku's head. However, no punch collided against him, so Izuku risked a look, cracking his eyes open ever so slightly to see much as Kitsuki's hand then tangled into Izuku's hair at the back of his head and banged his head against the wall of the building he was pinning the young boy against. Izuku gasps, more so in shock than pain as his head had already started to become numb. So, you think you're better than those stupid heroes, Deku? You think you're better than me? Kitsuki shouts angrily. Izuku squeezed his eyes closed again and sobbed. Izuku raised his arms up to his face and sobbed into them as he weakly protected himself from actions Kitsuki would take on him. Izuku felt himself panicking as he struggled to stand, Kitsuki's overpowering caramel scent making Izuku nauseous. Izuku was terrified. Of course not. You're stronger, faster, more popular, you have friends and have a powerful quirk. I'm just useless, Deku. Now please. Let me go, Izuku pronounced weakly, still sniffling and sobbing. But Izuku did something he had never thought to do, as it would only anger Kitsuki further. He pushed his hands against Kitsuki's chest and shoved him away from him. Izuku, now free from the trap Kitsuki had put, and ran like his life depended on it. You shitty nerd, get back here, Kitsuki roared. But for once in Izuku's life he did not listen. His head was screaming at him to turn back around, go back to Kitsuki and start begging on his hands and knees for forgiveness. But Izuku was just too scared. He normally allowed Kitsuki to do what he wished as it prevented worse punishments later, but Izuku ignored that fact. Maybe it was his recent outings as a vigilante give Izuku newfound courage he hadn't had before. But whatever it was, Izuku just continued to run to school. Izuku hesitantly walked into school, heavily winded after sprinting away from Kitsuki. He shook his head around, making sure to watch if anyone would come up to attack him. Mainly Kitsuki, as he didn't know how far away he had gotten from the teen. Izuku saw several students spot him and immediately go back to their friends, talking in a hushed tone. Izuku ducked his head and moved around the halls before eventually hiding in the bathroom. It wasn't a perfect spot to hide until the bell would ring, but it worked most of the time, and Izuku banked on it working again today. Izuku was filled with relief as the bell rung, signaling the day had officially begun. He walked to class as the hallways mostly began to filter out, so Izuku didn't have to worry about anyone suddenly pelting him with food or rocks. Izuku hated it when they threw food at him because it meant it would go to waste and perfectly good money was wasted. Izuku walks into class, but the atmosphere was slightly different. Not everyone turned to Izuku immediately to laugh or mock him as usual, so Izuku managed to reach his desk without any hiccups. He looked around to see what oddity was happening to make him invisible, and saw most of the class was focused on Kitsuki. His two goons were standing by his desk trying to talk with him, as Kitsuki angrily ignored their existence. "Come on, Bakugo. We're sorry," the one that had extendable fingers as a quirk said. Kitsuki scoffed and turned to him angrily. "F off. You practically pushed me into it, cowards. Now get away from me, or you will feel an explosion up your butt." Kitsuki barked, popping some explosions in his palms. Both boys nodded and gulped, backing away from Kitsuki, not interested in testing if the boy would hold true to his threat. Izuku took the opportunity while their attention wasn't on him to silently sneak to his desk. Izuku turned his head away at the speed of light, not wanting to be caught staring at Kitsuki while he was already in a foul mood. He didn't want to give the boy a reason into blasting him with his quirk again. He looked down with his desk with wide eyes. Resting on top of his carved desk full of hurtful words was a spider lily. Every day, that flower would appear on his desk without fail by the girl who sat directly in front of him. It may seem like a nice gesture until you recognize what the symbol of that flower means. A spider lily symbolizes death. The petals are crystal white, which is the color of the deceased in Japan. The tips of the flowers are black with weird droops at the end that give the appearance of running ink. Despite their dark meaning and the fact, the girl has been basically non-verbally telling him to go Unilive himself. Izuku can't help but think that these flowers are beautiful. So Izuku has been keeping the ones he had been getting recently in a vase by the windowsill he sits next to. Izuku picks up the flower and places it in the vase before sitting back down. The teacher has just walked in, so the lesson has just begun, and Izuku quenched the overarching feeling of dread. The bell rung and Izuku speed walked out of the classroom with zero issue. Kitsuki had refused to look at Izuku the entire lesson, which felt bad about because it meant he upset Kitsuki in a way the boy didn't like. He wondered if he could do anything to cheer him up before shaking his head. No, he doesn't need to look at me. I'm just a speck to him. Why should he look at me? Izuku thought to himself. Izuku held his head down as he walked, gripping his bag straps tight. Izuku then squeaked when he was forcefully pulled back by his bag. Izuku whimpered as he looked at his attackers. They were both of Kitsuki's friends. The boy with purple hair, that's flopped onto the right side of his head and has a stretchy finger quirk. Izuku thinks his name Tenefu, but Izuku can't be sure. He normally just hears Kitsuki call him Airhead. "Hey, Deku, saw your stunt that you pulled at the end of school. Still wanting to be a hero?" Tenefu mocked. Izuku didn't know how to reply, but couldn't when he felt a fist slam into his stomach. Thought Bakugo made it clue to not try and be a hero. Then you go off trying to be a hero for him. And you did absolutely nothing. Kitsuki's other friend barked, but Izuku could barely focus on that. His stomach was churning and the place where Tenefu had punched him was bearing in pain. Why was it hurting so bad? He could take Kitsuki's punches and explosions fine, and Izuku knew Kitsuki was stronger than him. But why did he feel nauseous and have urge to vomit? Izuku was squirming lightly, trying to fight the sensation to spill his guts all over these guys. He knew that he would be beat worse because of it, so he desperately tried keeping it in. "What's wrong? Can't take a weak punch," Tenefu said smugly before going in for a second punch. Izuku spat out and yelled in pain. He started coughing violently, which started to worry the two attackers. Afraid that they had actually done something bad, and they let Izuku go. Izuku dropped to the floor, his arms barely bracing his impact. But even as much as he tried to prevent it, Izuku vomited all over the floor. It wasn't that much since he had only taken a buttered piece of toast for breakfast and the contents of last night's dinner still in his system. Izuku crumpled right beside his dinner's puddle. Tears choked themselves out and all Izuku could feel was an immense amount of pain. Izuku saw black spots coming into his vision. Was he sick? It would make sense as he was running frantically around the past 2 nights, and he had gotten little sleep. If so, he had only felt little difference other than drowsiness and sore muscles since he woke up. Perhaps because his body had gotten used to different things than everybody else? It was possible. Izuku coughed weakly as he felt like he was dying. He weakly looked around him. He saw several people standing there, looking at him in shock. None of them were helping him. But it made sense. Why would they help a quirkless weakling like him? But Izuku still had one question when he saw everyone standing there. As his eyelids closed and he slipped unconscious, he asked himself one more question. Why hadn't Katsuki joined in? Izuku woke up to his head pounding with a strong migraine. His stomach felt like an iron ball was resting on top of it and would move around as he shifted him to lock him in place. It made Izuku want to hurl, but he had nothing left to spew out, so he could only hollowly cough. Izuku? He heard a sweet voice say in concern. Who would be concerned about him? Mom. But why would she be here? The last thing he remembers was passing out at school. Izuku cracks his eyes open. He looks to where he heard the voice, and lo and behold, his mother was looking over to him with a worried expression. He could see the nose behind him, but conversely, she had a completely neutral expression. His mother quickly ran over to him and got down close to his face, holding it between her hands. Izu baby, what happened to you? Are you okay? His mother said, her tone oozing out her feeling of worry. Izuku immediately felt horrible. The last thing he wanted to do was worry his mother. Why had he been so weak that a weak punch caused him to pass out? Izuku now became laced in guilt as he ruined his mother's day of relaxation to deal with his frail pain tolerance. Yeah, I'm fine. Just got a little lightheaded. That's all, Izuku replied, forcing a smile to his lips. His mom didn't look any less worried, though, which hurt Izuku more that he couldn't convince her that he was all right. His mother was looking at him, trying to see the lie. She let him out that morning, and he was perfectly fine. He wasn't acting sick, so there should have been no reason for him to have vomited everywhere before blacking out. Inko then heard a sigh, then looked towards the nurse, who looked slightly agitated and was rubbing her temple. Now that Izuku is awake, you can take him home. I would suggest that he doesn't come to school for the next 2 days to get rid of whatever vomit bug he has, the nurse said, before turning around and trying to walk away. Inko quickly stood up straight. Wait, shouldn't I take him to a hospital or something? A vomit bug doesn't make someone pass out, Inko said. The nurse groaned and turned her head that only one eye was looking at Inko. Don't waste their time with him. Just don't bring him anywhere for 2 or more days, the nurse said. She glared at Izuku before walking away. Izuku gulped at her glare and shivered. He knew all too well how much the nurse hated him. Thankfully, his mom didn't notice the nurse's look. Izuku, let's go, his mother said. Izuku's eyes widened at his mother's tone. She wasn't looking at him, and she sounded upset. Angry almost. Izuku had never seen his mom angry for around a decade now, and it made Izuku's limbs go numb in anxiety. Yes, Mom, he said shakily. With weak and scared legs, he followed his mother out of the school and into her car, ignoring the lock some of the staff sent his way. The entire time, they had not spoken, and Izuku could still feel the tense air his mother was giving off in suppressed anger. He was scared. Izuku buckled his seatbelt, shielding his eyes from the sun as his head was still dizzy. For the first time since he woke up, he saw his mother's face. Just like he had suspected, she was pissed. Izuku gulped and tentatively put a hand on her thigh. If she was going to yell at him, might as well get it over and done with. Mom, I'm sorry, Izuku said, his voice quivering into a stutter. He watched a tear drop down from his mother's cheek, and Izuku felt his heart break. His mother lowered her head, her hands gripping the wheel with shaking strength. Izuku heard his mom give a shallow breath. The bullying never stopped, did it? His mother asked. Izuku was taken aback by that question. His mouth went agape as he tried to answer but paused. Did he want to lie to his mother again? But the truth would only cause her much more pain knowing how he was being treated by everyone else. His mother turned to him. Tears streaks ran down his face. Izuku's breath hitched as he leaned away in reaction. His mind was screaming at him to deny. Just deny and lie. But the words couldn't slip out of his mouth because the look of sheer heartbreak over his mother's facial features tore him apart. It prevented him from speaking. His mother reached out to Izuku and gripped the clothing near his shoulders and squeezed it in her hands. She rested her head on Izuku's chest and cried even more. "Why, Izuku, why? Wouldn't you tell me?" His mother cried, her voice breaking. Tears shot out from Izuku as he hugged his mother tight. The voice in his head still screamed at him to tell his mother that this has been a misunderstanding, that she was wrong and that everything was fine. But the words weren't coming to his mouth, so he said the only words that were, "I didn't want you to worry," Izuku croaked. His mother shook her head violently. She pushed off of Izuku and looked at him in the eyes. Her cheeks were puffy and red and her eyes were growing crimson. "But you're hurt, baby. That Noste obviously doesn't like you. She thinks you're a waste of space. Do any of the staff treat you nicely?" His mother practically pleaded to him. Izuku could only lower his head in shame. No, not one of the staff treated him like the rest of the kids, but he deserved it. A quirkless freak couldn't be on the same level as their normal quirk students. He couldn't answer the question and he didn't want to see the betrayed look on his mother's face, so he turned away. Izuku knew the teachers had every right to treat him like the trash he was, but knew his mother would disagree with that. She was just so kind. After a few tense seconds of silence, letting the unspoken words flow through air, his mother finally let out a shriek of anger, frightening Izuku. No, you are not going to that school anymore. You're going to another one, and don't you dare worry about cost, young man. It is worth you being away from that hellhole," his mother yelled at him. Izuku squeaked and shook his head. He raised his arms up in front of him. "Mom, no. I don't want to do that," Izuku said quickly. His mother did a half-sigh, half-growl and slowly shook her head. She slowly raised her head back up and looked sympathetically at Izuku. "Honey, look, I know how much you'd miss Kitsuki, but you'd still see him outside of school," his mother said to him. Izuku's eyes widened and he rapidly shook his head from left to right. "Mom, know that." Izuku started before sighing. Looking down sadly. "Bakugo wouldn't care if I didn't go back," Izuku said quietly. He knew that would snap one of his mother's last remaining heartstrings. He knew that she believed that the two were still close after all these years, but he had to tell her that they weren't best friends anymore. Not even friends. But Kitsuki will still become a great hero, and Izuku wants to at least watch him achieve his goal. It could be the closest he could ever get to seeing the real thing. But hearing her son say that broke Inko. To her knowledge, Izuku and Kitsuki were still great friends. Not as close as they once were, but still always having each other's back. If something happened to Izuku, she had thought that Kitsuki would be there to help. But had Kitsuki joined in with the other kids to hurt Izuku, or just sit there, pretending it wasn't happening? Inko hoped it would be the latter, although that option still wasn't very good for the woman to think about. The reason I don't want to change schools is because that won't solve anything. I'll just be the quirkless new kid. I may even be treated worse depending on how the staff are there as well," Izuku said grimly. He heard his mom choke and raise her hand to her mouth. Izuku could only look at her sadly. She looked like she was in such pain, and it was all his fault. He then watched his mom straighten up and try and compose herself. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "Then we'll get you into online school," his mother said with determination. Izuku looked at her, slightly shocked to see that she was as much as a nervous Nelly as he was. Does something like that even exist?" he asked, not believing that a program like that existed. His mother sighed and shrugged. "I don't know, sweetie, but we'll look around. I am not letting you get hurt by others any longer, so you hear me. So, if I can get you into online school, I will, even if it costs a fortune." "Okay, baby," his mother said, her determination peaking in the octaves in her voice. Izuku was about to rebut but stopped himself. He wanted to be a vigilante and continue running out into the streets at night. He was able to sleep in on Sunday since it was a weekend, but only got less than 4 hours today. He got sick from the sudden change in action he was taking, Hardly doing any exercise to running around at night for 4 hours would be hard to manage if he had to wake up for school at around 6 o'clock. If Izuku was able to take his classes to his house, Izuku would be able to create a working schedule. Allow him to have a full 8 hours of rest, at minimum 4 hours of vigilante time, and tons of time for schoolwork and recreational activities, such as train his body and learn how to fight. Those two were things he wanted to do in the future. Izuku does feel bad for tricking his mum into doing this. He was being incredibly selfish, but she wants to make him happy, and Izuku does find joy in saving people. So Izuku sighed and smiled at his mum, nodding his head. "Yes, Mum," Izuku said, wiping away his tears. His mother did the same, smiling brightly to Izuku. She finally started the car. She drove out of the school's parking lot and went home. She helped Izuku up the stairs to their house and opened the door to his room, keeping his arm firmly grasped under his arm to help him walk. She led Izuku to his room and guided him to his bed. Izuku felt embarrassed by this but kept his mouth shut. He knew his mother really wanted to take care of him and ensure that he was all right. He did pass out after all, and he did have a bad migraine, so Izuku allowed himself to be tucked into his bed. "Everything will be all right, Izu. Let me fix it," his mother softly. Izuku smiled with a slight strain and closed his eyes. He could only nod in response. His mother would let Izuku rest. She stood up and carefully walked out of the room, not wanting to disturb Izuku as he drifted off to sleep. Izuku wanted to conserve his energy as he still intended to go out as a vigilante tonight. He just hoped he still didn't feel sick when he woke up. So, this was the end of part 2 of this series. Stay tuned for next part of this series, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.